Hi, class. So today we're going to be talking about the stigma of mental illness. And one of the reasons why this is one of the first things that we're going to go into in the course is because when we talk about categorization and diagnosis of mental health concerns, stigma is also something that goes in lockstep with it. It's something that is often the reason why people avoid receiving mental health care, and is also one of the reasons why people may minimize or diminish their own experiences even while they're suffering. And so let's dive into this a little bit today, with at least starting things off with a couple of what are referred to as case studies. Okay, so in these particular cases, they will be hypothetical case studies. So, what is a case study? Well, a case study is a process of or record of research in which detailed consideration is given to the development of a particular person, a group, or a situation over a period of time. It is a type of research method that is often used within psychology. It is not generalizable, but often can serve as a highly accurate real world example of how a generalizable diagnosis can play out at the individual level. So, it should be noted that these case studies that I'm going to discuss are hypothetical, inspired by actual cases, but with much of the information changed to protect the participants, I should say, um, because these are two different cases with bits and pieces of other cases mixed in that have the same diagnosis. Um, so let's get started. Cassie is an 18-year-old female from the West San Fernando Valley. She was a successful student in high school, graduating valedictorian and obtaining a National Merit Scholarship for her performance on the PSAT during her junior year. She was accepted to UC Berkeley, 400 miles away from home, where she received additional scholarships, giving her a free ride for her entire undergraduate education. Excited to start this new chapter in her life, Cassie's parents began the 5 hour drive to the Bay Area, where they will leave their only daughter for the first time in her life. The semester begins, as it always does, in mid to late August. Cassie meets the challenges with enthusiasm and does well in her classes for the first few weeks of the semester, as expected. Sometime around week 6, her friends start to notice she is despondent, detached, and falling behind in her work. After being asked about her condition, she replies that she's just a bit homesick. And her friends accept this answer as it is a typical response to leaving home and starting college for many students. A month later, her condition has not improved, but instead has worsened. She regularly shirks her responsibilities around her dorm, in her classes, and on her job at the campus, I should say, coffee shop. Cassie does not hang out with friends like she did when she first arrived at college and stays in bed most of the day. Concerned, Cassie's friends contact the health and wellness office for help, but Cassie refuses treatment, stating, quote, "I'm not crazy, I'm just sad." Now, Cassie's story, though hypothetical, is true of many freshmen leaving home for the first time to earn a higher education degree. Whether in Northern California or rural areas of the Central Valley, most students will experience some sort of transition. Doesn't always look like this, but it's not always easy either. Now, while most students recover from a period of depression and go on to be functional members of their collegiate environment, enjoying their experience and becoming accomplished scholars, some students learn to cope on their own, and others seek assistance from their university's health and wellness or from friends who've already been through the same ordeal. These are normal reactions. Again, normal is relative, but these can be considered to be normal reactions. However, In cases like Cassie's, the path to recovery was not initially as clear. Instead of learning how to cope, her depression increases until it reaches clinical levels and becomes an impediment to success in multiple domains of life, such as home, work, school, and social circles. And her failure to reach out is a big part of this because we know that as humans, we heal in the context of community, whether that community is one that includes family, friends, or mental health workers. And so if we isolate, which can be a common reaction when mental health conditions pop up, it tends to make things worse. One of the reasons why people tend to isolate is due to social stigma. Let's consider another case example. Alex was a bright, introverted student from Riverside County, California. He excelled in high school, especially in math and computer science, and won a regional programming competition in his senior year. His parents describe him as quite a perfectionist or a quiet perfectionist, I should say, with few friends but a strong internal drive. There is a family history of mental illness, something to keep in mind. His maternal uncle was diagnosed with schizophrenia in his 20s. Alex enrolled at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and initially adjusted well. He joined the programming club and maintained a 3.9 GPA in his freshman year, not too shabby. He was living in a dorm, but spent most of his time alone, often coding late into the night. In the fall semester of his sophomore year, subtle changes began to appear. Social withdrawal was the first thing to show. He stopped attending club meetings and avoided group projects. Then came academic decline. His grades began to slip. He missed two project deadlines. Odd behavior started to emerge. His roommate in his dorm noted that Alex had become increasingly paranoid, placing tape over his laptop camera and whispering to himself. Sleep disturbances started to become apparent. Alex reported sleeping 2 to 3 hours a night, believing he needed to remain alert for a quote unquote pattern of surveillance. Alex refused to talk to campus mental health services, dismissing concerns by saying, quote, they wouldn't understand. The system is watching me. In November, Alex was found wandering the library barefoot at 3 a.m., muttering about, quote, code embedded in the carpet, and trying to, quote, decode the messages sent by the light fixtures. He believed a secret government AI was communicating with him through flickers in his screen, and that professors were involved in a plot to extract his algorithmic ideas. Campus security was called after he began yelling at a janitor who he mistook for a quote-unquote operative. He was transported to a local hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. At the hospital, Alex presented with delusions, paranoid in nature. The idea was that he was being watched and persecuted. They were also grandiose in nature, the idea being that he was chosen to decode a critical algorithm. He also presented with hallucinations, visual. He was seeing messages in light patterns, and auditory, hearing a synthetic voice guiding him. He presented with disorganized thought, tangential speech, and fragmented associations. He had flat affect, meaning his overall presentation of his expressed mood appeared to be monotone and unemotional. Despite intense content, his emotional expression was minimal. After 72 hours of observation and a psychiatric workup, he was provisionally diagnosed with first episode psychosis, with strong indicators of schizophrenia spectrum disorder, pending a longer term observation. So, Alex, in this example, in this case study, was stabilized with antipsychotic medication, in particular risperidone. And after 2 weeks in an inpatient psychiatric unit, he showed reduced hallucinations and began to question some of his initially strong-held beliefs during the psychotic episode. Post-discharge, meaning after he was released from the hospital, he was enrolled in an early psychosis intervention program that included medication management, cognitive behavioral therapy, family psychoeducation so his family could support him, and academic reintegration support. Over the next 6 months, Alex returned to part-time studies, working closely with disability services. And although after this period, he occasionally struggled with residual paranoia and at times low motivation, he has not experienced relapse. And his care team is optimistic as to his prognosis. So here you can see an example of how, even though stigma could have been present, the the quick intervention with mental health services made the difference between a long-term psychotic disorder and long-term emotional health. And that's not insignificant. That is something that, whether it be a hypothetical case study or a real world case study, we see again and again and again, whether the presentation is severe mental illness, such as a psychotic disorder, or expected uh, depressive kind of adjustment to a new environment, right? Early intervention is key, whatever that support might look like. Obviously, the more severe the presentation, the more debilitating the presentation, the more necessary that support is to be professional and clinical. But let's talk about stigma as, in terms of its impacts, in terms of why it exists, how it exists, and how it really negatively interacts with mental health. So, in the previous lecture, we discussed the fact that care can be sought out in a variety of ways. The problem is that, just like in our case studies, many people who need care never seek it out. So, why is that? Well, we already know that society dictates what is considered to be abnormal behavior through culture and social norms. And you can likely think of a few implications from that. But to fully understand society's role in why people do not seek care, we need to determine the psychological processes underlying this phenomena in the individual. So, social cognition is the process through which we collect information from the world around us and then interpret it. The collection process occurs through what we know as sensation, or detecting physical energy emitted or reflected by physical objects. Detection occurs courtesy of our eyes, ears, nose, skin, mouth, via vision, hearing, smell, touch, and taste, respectively. Um, Once collected, the information is relayed to the brain through the neural impulse, where it is processed and interpreted, or meaning is added to this raw sensory data, which we call perception. Now, one way meaning is added is by taking the information we just detected and using it to assign people to categories or groups. We are categorical thinkers because it helps us to process information and understand the world around us. For each category, we have what is referred to as a schema, or a set of beliefs and expectations about a group of people believed to apply to all members of the group and based on experience. Now, you might think of them as, when you think of a schema, as organized ways of making sense of experience. So it is during our initial interaction with someone that we collect information about them. We assign the person to a category for which we have a schema, and then use that to affect how we interact with them. In essence, it's a filter by which we see and process information and see and process people's behavior. First impressions, often referred to as the primacy effect, primacy, it's prime, it's the first thing we experience, are important because even if we obtain new information that should override an incorrect initial assessment, the initial impression is unlikely to change. We call this the perseverance effect, or belief perseverance. Stereotypes are special types of schemas that are very simplistic, very strongly held, and not based on firsthand experience. They are heuristics, or mental shortcuts that allow us to assess the collected information very quickly. One piece of information, such as skin color, can be used to assign the person to a schema for which we have a stereotype based on a particular skin tone. Now, keep in mind, stereotypes are based on outside information. It's a special type of schema that are very simplistic, strongly held, and not based on firsthand experience. However, certain cognitive biases can serve as additional filters to reinforce stereotypes based on personal experiences. So, what that means is not that the stereotype is true, but that if we are prone to a selection bias, we're going to discard information that is that works against a stereotype and attend to information that reinforces a stereotype. And what that means is you're essentially cherry picking information. This is referred to as confirmation bias. And if you've taken social psychology already, you might be familiar with that term. Confirmation bias doesn't mean that the cherry picked information is accurate. It's an incomplete picture that, if put together with the entire narrative, might then present a more complete or more accurate picture that looks very different from the stereotype. But if we cherry pick it, it can reinforce it. So this can affect how we think, feel, or feel about a person or how we behave towards them. Again, human beings tend to imply things about an individual solely due to a distinguishing feature and disregard anything inconsistent with that stereotype. And, evolutionarily, we can talk about why this might have been helpful as an early signaling mechanism. If something looked, or someone or some being looked different than one's immediate relational group, and we had to detect potential threats. And so, from an evolutionary perspective, even if we were inaccurate most of the time, if we were accurate some of the time, it may have aided in survival. And so, therefore, it was reinforced generation after generation after generation and became embedded in our way of being. So, while hate is not inborn, stereotyping may fit a framework that is long past its expiration date, but embedded in our kind of evolutionary genetic code that we have yet to evolve fully out of. So, something to think about in terms of one of the reasons why stigma and mental illness may exist, even though it's actually really antithetical to seeking care that can actually get one feeling better, which is all somebody wants to feel when they're afflicted by a mental health concern that makes them feel bad. Now, social identity theory states that people categorize their social world into meaningfully simplistic representations of groups of people. These representations are then organized as prototypes, or, quote, fuzzy sets of relatively limited numbers of category defining features that not only define one category, but serve to distinguish it from other categories. And this is as written by Foddy and Hogg, cited in Foddy and colleagues' article in 1999. We construct in groups and out groups and categorize them as and categorize individuals as in one of the two. We categorize ourselves as members often of an in group. So the self is assimilated into the salient, the visible in group prototype, which indicates what cognitions, affect, and behavior we may exhibit. In essence, if we identify with a group, we start to act as if, we start to act like the kind of phenotypical, the presenting markers of the way a group looks, acts, the things we associate with a group, stereotypes that we might have about a group that we find favorable. And even if it might not come naturally to us, if we identify with that group as being the in group and we want to be like that group or consider ourselves to be part of that in group, we may take on those characteristics. Now, stereotyping, out-group homogeneity, and in-group, out-group bias, normative behavior, and conformity are all based on self-categorization. How so? Well, outgroup homogeneity occurs when we see all members of an outside group as the same. This leads to a tendency to show favoritism to and exclude or hold a negative view of members outside of one's immediate group called the in-group out-group bias. Again, something that you might be intimately familiar with from your social psychology class if you've taken it yet. The negative view or set of beliefs about a group of people is what we call prejudice. And this can result in acting in a way that is negative against a group of people called discrimination. It should be noted that a person can be prejudicial without being discriminatory, since most people do not act on their attitudes or toward others due to social norms against such behavior. Likewise, a person or institution can be discriminatory without being prejudicial. For example, a company that requires an applicant to have a certain education level or to be able to lift 80 pounds as part of job responsibilities would be prejudicial. It's prejudice towards people who have certain abilities or experiences because it's part of a job description. Now, individuals without a degree or ability to lift will be removed from consideration for the job. But this, or I should say, this is discrimination. This discriminatory act does not mean that the company has a negative view of people without degrees or a negative view of people with an inability to lift a heavy weight, right? So this is the distinction between discrimination and prejudice, right? Prejudice is holding a negative view of people of a certain group, right? And discrimination is using that prejudice to select out, or alternatively, not having prejudice at all, but selecting out based on a certain set of criteria. So it can be both. You may even hold a negative view of a specific view of or a specific group of people, I should say, and not be aware of it. An attitude we are unaware of is called an implicit attitude, which stands in contrast to explicit attitudes, which are the views within our conscious awareness. Now, we've spent quite a lot of time and space understanding how people gather information about the world and people around them. We process this information and we use it to make snap judgments about others, to form groups for which stereotypes might exist, and then potentially hold negative views of this group and behave negatively towards them as a result. Just one piece of information can be used to set this series of mental events into motion. Outside of skin color, the label associated with having a mental disorder can also be used. Stereotypes about people with mental disorders can quickly and easily transform into prejudice when people in a society determine the schema to be correct and form negative emotions and evaluations of this group. This, in turn, can lead to discriminatory practices such as an employer refusing to hire, a landlord refusing to rent an apartment, or avoiding a romantic relationship with somebody, all due to that person having a mental illness. Now, overlapping with prejudice and discrimination in terms of how people with mental disorders are treated is stigma, or when negative stereotyping, labeling, rejection, and loss of status occur, stigma takes on three forms, right? And there's actually really four forms, but let's kind of break it down. Um, when members of a society endorse negative stereotypes of people with a mental disorder and discriminate against them, this is referred to as a public stigma. They may avoid them altogether, resulting in social isolation. An example is when an employer intentionally does not hire a person because their mental illness is discovered. Label avoidance, to avoid being labeled as crazy or nuts, or people needing care, may avoid seeking it altogether or stop care once it's started because of these labels that they may perceive others as holding against them or that they may hold against themselves just by nature of feeling like they need care. Due to these labels, funding for mental health services could be restricted, and instead, physical health services may be funded. Self-stigma is when people with mental illness internalize the negative stereotypes and prejudice and in turn discriminate against themselves. Now, they may experience shame, reduced self esteem, hopelessness, low self efficacy, and a reduction in coping mechanisms. An obvious consequence of these potential outcomes is the why try effect, or the person saying, why should I try and get that job? I'm not worthy of it. Another form of stigma that's worth noting that is that of courtesy stigma, or when stigma affects people associated with a person who has a mental disorder. So Carnelli, Miller, and colleagues in 2013 found that families of the afflicted were often blamed, rejected, or devalued when others learned that a family member had a serious mental illness. Due to this, they felt hurt and betrayed, and an important source of social support during a difficult time had disappeared, resulting in greater levels of distress for those families. To cope, some families concealed their relative's illness, and some parents struggled to decide whether it was their place to disclose their child's condition. Others fought with the issue of confronting the stigma through attempts at education versus just ignoring it due to not having enough energy or desire to maintain personal boundaries. There was also a need to understand the responses of others and attribute it to a lack of knowledge, experience, and or media coverage. And in some cases, the reappraisal allowed family members to feel compassion for others rather than feeling put down or blamed. The authors concluded that each family, quote, develops its own coping mechanisms, which vary according to its personal experiences, values, and the extent of other commitments. And that, quote, coping strategies families employ change over time. Other effects of stigma include experiencing work related discrimination, resulting in higher levels of self stigma and stress, higher rates of suicide, especially when treatment is not available, and decreased likelihood of future help seeking intention. And that latter point, the decreased likelihood of future help seeking intention, is significant when we think about people avoiding the treatment that could get them well and lead to better outcomes across their life course. So the results of the latter study, the one that made that point, that was Lally and colleagues in 2013, and you don't need to know the names and authors of studies, by the way, for this course, but just to kind of help organize the data. The results of that latter study showed that personal contact with somebody with a history of mental illness led to a decreased likelihood of seeking help. Now, this is important because 48% of the university collected sample for that study stated that they needed help for an emotional or mental health issue during the past year, but did not seek help. So nearly half of the sample was affected by bias that impeded their ability to actually get the help that they needed. Similar results have been reported in other studies, including Eisenberg, Downs, Goldberstein, and Zivin in their 2009 study. It's also important to point out that social distance, a result of stigma, has also been shown to increase throughout the lifespan, suggesting that anti-stigma campaigns in the media should focus on older adults, if not primarily, then significantly. So that brings us to the end of this lecture, but I hope that this illustrates the importance of understanding stigma as it can be associated with diagnosis, help seeking, and interaction with mental health services. And it's worth noting that at this college, there is a mental health counseling center that offers time limited, no cost therapy for all students. Something to think about. In any event, Take good care. Enjoy the rest of your week. And I will look forward to continuing to read your discussion posts. We will have new lectures up at the beginning of next week. Have a good one, guys.